I'm excited. I'm excited to spend this afternoon with you to share some thoughts on this idea of building a new American democracy. Building a new American democracy. We are experiencing something that is unique in American history. We are experiencing the literal collapse of American democracy. We're not merely debating at this moment anymore how to preserve democracy. We shouldn't be debating how to preserve democracy. We are fighting. The fight that we are engaged in now is about whether or not democracy in America should exist at all. This isn't a debate or discussion about policies. This is a debate or discussion about the fundamentals of whether or not democracy should exist in America at all. And this collapse is visible, and we can see it on a daily basis. We see courts retreating from defending basic rights. We see state legislatures right here in Georgia eroding basic civil protections. Voting rights are being systematically rolled back. Teachers in K through 12, as well as colleges and universities, the college at our university I teach at right now, the Ohio State University, are facing this effort to silence us, and librarians are facing censorship in their profession. Universities as a whole, again, not K through 12, not just K through 12, we find them bending the knee. Ohio State University rolled back 50 years of diversity, equity, and inclusion programs within a few weeks of the President of the United States, Donald Trump, coming into office. And we see media corporations and corporate law firms capitulating to efforts to silence free speech. These are all signs and signals of America and democracy collapsing. But in every moment in which we see collapse, there's also opportunity. There's also opportunity. And there's a couple things that I think are worth pointing out that we need to be aware of in this particular moment. The first thing is that this period of democratic collapse has exposed the weak underpinnings, the weak foundation of American democracy. If these institutions could collapse so quickly, they were not strong enough to begin with, highlighting systemic weaknesses. If we could spend the last 60 years, 50 to 60 years, building up programs surrounded around or revolving around diversity, equity, and inclusion. I mean, first they were affirmative action, and we've evolved. We've been rolling back the titles, but it took 60 years, inadequate as they were, to get to this point. If they can be done away with within 6 weeks, then they weren't strong enough in the first place. The collapse reveals opportunity. The moment of institutional collapse reveals an opportunity for transformation. In other words, this isn't just a time to be like, man, this is terrible. This is a time to say, you know what? What are we going to make out of what is collapsing? What can we build anew from the rubble that is around our feet? And what we need to build anew is a new inclusive democracy, a chance to forge a democracy that truly serves and represents all people and not just a handful. But in order to do that, we have to act decisively now. There is no waiting. The moment is now. So the question before us is not, can this version of American democracy be saved, the version that we currently live under? Should we just be focusing on preservation and reform of what exists? That's not the question that we need to be wrestling with. The question that we need to be wrestling with is, what can be built in its place? How do we seize this moment of opportunity, not just to engage in preservation and reform and build back what was, but how can we envision and then actualize an alternative, new democratic institutions that are bolder, that are more encompassing, and that are stronger, that will never be able to be wiped away in a moment's notice. The question is not how do we preserve, the question is, or even persevere. The question is, what are we going to do in the wake and in the aftermath? We are burdened, though, in this charge, in this effort, by the myth of perpetual democratic progress. And by we, I mean all of us as Americans, and certainly those who believe in freedom. This myth, this belief that American democracy naturally and automatically expands towards greater inclusion. This idea that, yes, we may have limited democracy in the past, but this is America and things always get better, things always get more democratic. The problem is this isn't historically true. There are literally only a few moments in American history where we see democracy actually expanding. For the vast majority of this American experiment, we have seen democracy becoming less expansive and efforts to limit democracy and not expand it. But if we fall victim or prey to this myth, what it actually does is it engenders or fosters complacency and complicity. Because if we believe that democracy or the expansion of democracy and democratic progress is natural and automatic, then what we're saying is that the key to creating change is simply the passage of time. That if we just allow time to pass, then the course will correct. But history tells us something different. History tells us that the arc of the moral universe will only bend towards justice if we exert the force necessary to bend it in that direction. So if we want democracy, then we have to do the work to create democracy. And if we don't want democracy, if we want to assume that things will only get better, then we're actually being complicit in the rollback of democratic norms and standards. So we have to talk seriously and significantly about how change occurs and what it takes for change to happen. We also have to reconcile with some hard truths about American democracy. That American democracy has always been fragile, incomplete, and exclusionary by design. It's not an accident that people have been excluded from the American democratic experiment. That's the way this country was built. And at the same time, understanding and recognizing that democratic gains have always been the result of these two things: constant struggle and resistance, led by Black folk, led by African Americans. Now, these two we have to wrestle with. American democracy has always been fragile, and the ways in which change has actually occurred has been a result of the willingness of African Americans to sacrifice and struggle, not just for themselves, but to create greater freedom for everyone who is here. There are three moments in particular of democratic crisis, and at each of these moments, African Americans have confronted this crisis and pushed the country closer to its professed ideals, emphasis on professed. And these three moments, the American Revolution, we see the soaring rhetoric of freedom, while at the same time the preservation of the institution of slavery. The second era is the Reconstruction era, in which we see a brief expansion of democracy, but followed by a violent white supremacist backlash. And the third era is the Civil Rights Movement, where mass mobilization occurred to dismantle legalized apartheid. And what I want to do for the next few minutes is talk about and explore these three moments. What is it that African Americans were up against, those who believe in freedom? What were they up against? And then what came of those particular moments? The first, the American Revolution. We're coming up on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And there's going to be a lot of myths and misconceptions perpetuated as we enter into this season of celebration. We have to be clear that the American Revolution, yes, it did indeed produce soaring rhetoric around questions of freedom, but it did so while preserving one of the most heinous institutions that the world has ever created, the institution of slavery. Last week was Constitution Day, a day set aside where the nation is supposed to celebrate, reflect upon, and celebrate the United States Constitution. One of the things that we're seeing happening at colleges, state colleges, and universities around the country is that state legislatures are trying to impose more nostalgia than history. They're trying to tell us what we're supposed to teach in the classroom. And I teach at a state university, Ohio State University, although sometimes I forget that I'm actually a public employee. I just be talking stuff, right? And I forget that I'm a public employee. But Ohio has created, trying, as they're inching towards the Floridification of the university system in the state of Ohio, they've created a center for civic engagement and dialogue under the premise of creating space for diverse ideologies. But they held a Constitution Day event, and they brought in someone to speak about Frederick Douglass and the Constitution. And I'm trying to stay away from these folks. I got enough issues I got to deal with, but I can't have somebody come to my house talking about Frederick Douglass and the Constitution. So I had to make my presence known. So I go and I sit in, and among the many terrible things that this gentleman was saying was that the Constitution itself was a anti-slavery document. Now, I want you to file that away for a second, right? Because we're going to get to 1787 in a second, but we still got to deal with 1786, because you don't get to the Constitution without understanding that the people, understanding who these folk were who are creating and laying the foundation for this nation. When we're talking about Thomas Jefferson, we're talking about somebody who is certainly putting down tremendous thoughts and ideas about what it is to live in a free society. But we have to be clear, and Black folk have always understood this, that all men are created equal didn't apply to them. It was never meant to. They were so sure in their understanding that they didn't have to qualify it. They didn't have to qualify that it didn't apply to women. They didn't have to qualify that it didn't apply to indigenous people. They didn't have to qualify that it didn't apply to African Americans. But African Americans understood this, that it didn't apply to them. But they saw in the revolutionary rhetoric this opportunity to advance the cause of abolition. There are those who will say, and one of the gentlemen who was speaking on Constitution Day, I mean, he had his talking points down. They will say that, Black folk, African Americans, during slavery and during the civil rights era, they believed in the founding ideals of this nation because they consistently will use the words of the Declaration of Independence to advocate for freedom. Dr. King celebrated the Declaration of Independence and Frederick Douglass. No, they weren't. Let's be clear. They understood the inherent contradictions. What they were doing was saying, these are your words, and we are going to make you live up to them, even though we know this is not what you meant. You put it on paper, and we're not going to let you take it back. That was your mistake, and we are going to exploit it. So when we see historically African-American activists, those who are fighting for freedom, using the rhetoric of the revolution, they're not doing it believing that this is what these folk believed. They understood the context out of which it came, but they're using the rhetoric of the oppressor to find liberation for the oppressed. And we see early examples of that. In 1777, Elizabeth Freeman, Mum Bet in Massachusetts, suing for her freedom, citing all men are created equal. In Connecticut, enslaved African American men petitioned the Connecticut Assembly, 1779, saying, listen, we believe in freedom, we deserve our freedom, and right now you're debating not just abolition, but a gradual abolition, and not immediate abolition. And they're saying, no, these are your words, we need to have immediate abolition. So states in the North love to play this idea that they were on the right side of history and they embraced abolition. You know when Connecticut finally abolished slavery? 1849. 1849. a decade before the Civil War. Black folk, enslaved men in 1779 are saying, no, it needs to be immediate. And they're using the rhetoric of the revolution to advance their cause. Unfortunately, in this instance, it was dismissed. So that gets us to the Constitution. Because the American the revolution, the rhetoric of the revolution, Declaration of Independence, starts the nation on this journey, but the Constitution is the law of the land. The Constitution is the foundation. And the founders embed white supremacy into the very foundation of this nation, into the framework of governance. And so this fellow who comes up got paid very well to come speak at Ohio State University and spread these lies. The first thing he says, the revolution, the Constitution, and all this revolves around the Constitution. We talk about democracy. But the Constitution is this anti-slavery document. And of all the things he said, I had to stop him there. And I said, that's ridiculous. What are you saying? We have not only the 3/5 clause, but we have the ban on the discussion of the slave trade. Like, this is what people don't understand. The Constitution is these three areas in which we're talking about protecting and maintaining, or we're referencing the institution of slavery. And the second is the ban on discussing, abolishing the slave trade. This is how maniacal these enslavers were. They said, we're never going to mention, this is another thing this fellow talks about. He said, well, they don't actually mention slavery in the Constitution, so therefore it must be anti-slavery. I said, stop doing that. They didn't have the courage to mention slavery because they knew it was wrong. So they use all these euphemisms. And so the Atlantic slave trade, they say that's the one subject. There's only one subject mentioned in the American Constitution that Congress was forbidden from even discussing for 20 years. Only one topic, and that was the abolition of the slave trade. So this fellow's going to say, well, that shows that this was an anti-slavery document. I said, no, this shows that the founders were creating economic protection. They were insulating enslavers, saying you got 20 years to bring in as many black laborers as you can. And then we're going to cut it off. And he says, well, Jefferson was an enslaver. And Jefferson is the one who signs it. I said, because Jefferson was worried that bringing in more enslaved Africans, what they call saltwater Africans, would lead to another Haiti. He was worried about the implications. And they also did absolutely nothing. Once the Atlantic slave trade is finally abolished in 1808, they did nothing about the internal domestic slave trade. The trafficking of over 1 million African people from the states of the Upper South to the Lower South. They were fully invested in the institution of slavery. And they also, and this is critically important, they also put the federal government on the side of slavery, on the side of unfreedom, by passing or enacting a fugitive slave clause. So all that stuff that we'll hear later on about states' rights was nonsense, because enslavers wanted the federal government to impose their will on states that did not have the institution of slavery. That is our starting point when we're talking about the Constitution or we're talking about democracy. And this is important because this means that for the first 75 years or so of this nation's history, of this democracy, that the federal government was fully on the side of denying freedom. Fully on the side of denying freedom. So when we talk about this, we're in this moment now where we're seeing the federal government attacking basic civil rights, civil liberties, and human rights. And people are shocked. Oh my God, and we should be shocked by the way in which this is happening and the rapidity at which this is happening, and to see the Supreme Court rolling back fundamental rights, to see them do this now. Yes, we should be shocked, but we shouldn't be surprised, because this is more normative than anything else. More normative than anything else. The federal government starts out on the side against freedom and liberty. And it's only because of the actions of African Americans determined to get their freedom that we begin to see a shift. So that brings us to this period of the Civil War and Reconstruction, in this second moment, a second reckoning, if you will, in which we have in which we see sort of American people broadly defined with these sort of conflicting goals and ambitions. The Confederacy, this was a war to preserve the institution of slavery. And this will tell you everything you need to know about the Constitution as a pro-slavery document. That the Confederacy, once it's established, you know what they use as their model for their Constitution? The U.S. Constitution. Their argument was that you are not living up to the Constitution's protections for the institution of slavery, and if they got everything else wrong, they got that right. And what they said was there's nothing wrong with the Constitution. We just have to make it stronger and more explicit. No more euphemisms. This is about protecting the institution of slavery. And so they understood what they were working with. And for white Northerners, the aim initially, of course, was not to end slavery, but was to preserve the nation. Was to preserve the nation. The fellow who was speaking the other day, he said, Frederick Douglass, again, how they twist the history. He said, well, Frederick Douglass, believed so much in America's promise that he believed in preserving the Union. He didn't want to break away. And again, twisting what he understood. You can't say that, Frederick Douglass believed in this project, so therefore he didn't want the South to succeed. He didn't want the South to succeed because he understood that if the South succeeded, those 4 million black folk would never have their freedom. That the only way they were going to have their freedom is if the Union stayed together. That wasn't an argument for the preservation of Union because he believed in democracy, American style. It was because he believed in the freedom for his people. Because the North was fighting a war to preserve the Union. And if that could be done, if Lincoln could do that without abolishing slavery, then absolutely he would. That was his mission. See, we get confused and we see this, we teach this especially outside the South because, in the North and the West, we want to be on the right side of history. It makes us feel comfortable. And so we'll talk about Abraham Lincoln as this great abolitionist as though he also didn't believe in white supremacy. You can be an abolitionist and still believe in white supremacy. The two can coexist. And then they'll point to Frederick Douglass like this guy did and point to Frederick Douglass and be like, but Frederick Douglass, we know that Lincoln was a great humanitarian because he had this relationship with Frederick Douglass. That's his one black friend who he only met twice. Twice. What the hell are you talking about? It was Frederick Douglass and it was African Americans who understood that this had to be a war to end slavery. If you want to talk about white heroes, you can have Abraham Lincoln. Give me John Brown. John Brown was the one who was willing not only to sacrifice his life to end slavery, but he was willing to sacrifice the life of his children. 2 of his sons died at the raid at Harper's Ferry. This was Frederick Douglass's friend. This was his partner. John Brown invites him to dinner and seats him at the head of the house and says, he eats before the rest of my family in Akron, Ohio. So we have models. We just pointed to the wrong ones. But it was African Americans who said, no, this has to be a fight for liberation. And they forced the issue. So emancipation comes out of military necessity, out of military expediency. Lincoln gets there, but out of necessity. Because he's going to lose the war. He's going to lose the nation if he doesn't bring about or make this a righteous cause to end slavery, to tap into the manpower, the woman power of African Americans, enslaved folk who were running to Union lines, and to put weapons in the hands of nearly 200,000 black men to fight for the Union. That's where emancipation comes from in this struggle. But once we do achieve that victory, once slavery is over finally, then we get a radical reworking and expansion of the Constitution. So if we're thinking about what are we going to do in the current situation and how can we do it, we got to deal with this Constitution. If we're still going to be here, then we have to deal with not just the 1787 Constitution, but the critical moment of reworking the Constitution that comes out of this Civil War conflict and the addition of the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. 13th Amendment abolishing slavery, 14th Amendment extending citizenship, and the 15th Amendment extending voting rights protections to African-American men. A few years ago, 2 years ago, that feels like 100 years ago, when Ketanji Brown Jackson was going through a confirmation hearing. And I remember sort of watching that, and they asked her about originalism, which is the sort of political conservatives, Antonin Scalia and all these guys, one of the ways in which they try to manipulate constitutional law. They say we have to go back and interpret everything through the lens of the original thinking of the framers. Now, we just said who they were and what they wanted. So they say, no, we got to point to that. And so I forget what it was who was asking Ketanji Brown, and they tried to trip her up. And they said, could you explain to us your thinking on originalism? And she gave what I thought at the time was a very peculiar answer. And she said, well, there's nothing wrong with originalism. I see the value and merit of understanding the ways in which sort of the Constitution emerges out of context. And I was like, all right, hold on now, right? We know how this has been used. Like, well, where are you going with this? And she sort of left it at that. And I said, well, I guess, she's just playing politics with this to get through the confirmation. And she gets confirmed. And then one of the first cases that comes about has to do with January 6th, if you will recall, and case coming out of Colorado and excluding Donald Trump from the ballot because he had participated in this insurrection. And when it came to the oral arguments, what did Ketanji Brown Jackson do? She said, us being originalists, we need to go to the original intent of the 14th Amendment and what this was. And she threw their argument back at them, and they didn't know what to do. But they're not genuine in their legal theory. And so when she said, let's deal with the original intent of the 14th Amendment, suddenly, no, that doesn't apply. We have to look at this moment, because what we see in the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment is an expansion of democracy for the first time. For the first time, the Constitution is expanded to create a vision that becomes more multiracial. Like, this is the moment, this period, this 5-year period that is so critical, that makes the Constitution somewhat redeemable, because now it can apply to everyone. African Americans in this moment, and it's fitting that we are at the Morehouse College Human Rights Festival. Also within this time period, as a good Morehouse man, I would be remiss to note that it was 1867 that Morehouse College was founded. But one of the things that we see coming out of emancipation in this moment is that African Americans aren't just interested in the Constitution and constitutional amendments. They aren't just simply interested in securing basic civil rights. They're also interested in securing human rights. So one of the things that we've done, and I understand why it was done during the Cold War era. Up until the Cold War era, in the 1950s, African Americans, when they were asked and talked about what they were fighting for and what their struggle was and what their goal was, they always talked about freedom. And even during the civil rights movement, we hear people, what do you have? You have freedom songs and freedom schools and freedom parties. The term freedom is what Black folk had historically always talked about. But during the Cold War and the Cold War pressures, the idea of freedom and talking about freedom and securing freedom was used to undermine the argument of African American activists. Because if you were talking about freedom, then you were talking about a communist agenda. And so those who are lobbying the federal government, the NAACP and the like, they say, okay, we have to shift. We have to stop talking about freedom. We got to start talking about civil rights. That was a strategic decision. It made sense in the moment. But what was lost was the human rights goals and objectives. Because civil rights ain't human rights. Civil rights are those rights that are granted and protected by government. Human rights are those rights that are granted and protected by God, because you are breathing in this world. And that's what African Americans always understood. They understood that they're fighting both to secure their civil rights and their human rights. The two together. I call them freedom rights, but that's what we're talking about. So before emancipation, black folk are saying, look, we got to fight for our freedom. That's how you build an equitable society, an equitable world. And afterward, they're like, all right, we're here. No boats are coming to get us. We need to secure both our civil rights and our human rights, and that's what they fight for. So the agenda for the next 150 so years is established at this moment. But one of the things that we do, and we do a terrible job of this, is that we don't take African Americans, and particularly in this moment, enslaved African Americans or newly emancipated African Americans, and throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, working class, poor African Americans, we don't take them seriously as political thinkers. If we took enslaved African Americans seriously as political thinkers, we would know that they knew what to do at the moment of emancipation and what they always wanted. They didn't need any missionaries coming from outside to tell them what to do. They understood what freedom was. Nobody had a better understanding of what it meant to be free in this society, in a slave society, than those who were living in the presence of those who get to enjoy their freedom, and yet they are denied it. Don't talk to me about James Madison understanding what fundamental freedoms were and what rights a government should deny people, that he somehow magically pulled that from the great Enlightenment thinkers. All he had to do was look outside his damn window at the 100 or so enslaved people that he was keeping in bondage. And these people, Madison, he's a third generation enslaver. 6 generations of African people his family holds under bondage, and we act like that was his side hustle. That's who he was. And so African Americans understood that, and they're taking that with them into freedom. So we're engaged in this human rights festival. It is not civil rights adjacent. It is central to the movement that black folk have been fighting for. And so we see these major constitutional victories, these legal victories. But like Newton's third law of motion, with every action comes an equal and opposite reaction. And we see that Reconstruction does not fail this attempt to create a multiracial democracy. Reconstruction does not fail. Reconstruction is defeated. That's an important difference, an important distinction. Because at the moment of emancipation, while African Americans are trying to pursue their freedom and create a new America, create a new democracy in this moment in time, white Southerners, their determination is to do what? To try to recreate the labor controls that they lost when slavery was ended. We talk about it, we teach. One of the many lessons I learned here at Morehouse College, at dear old Morehouse, was that, the moment of emancipation, when slavery's ended, white folk don't suddenly stop believing in white supremacy. Like the principal legacy of slavery is the belief in white supremacy as a justification for the exploitation of black folk. And we weren't run around pretending like, at the moment of emancipation, white folk and white Southerners in particular are like, oh, bad, we didn't know y'all wanted to be free. So they don't want black folk to be free. And so they engage in this process of trying to return them as close to the institution of slavery as possible, because slavery was an economic institution. This is about exploiting black labor. But in order to exploit black labor, you have to have legal protections. And so we see between 1890 and 1910, this is American democracy, and why we have to move away from this idea of perpetual progress. Between 1890 and 1910, every state in the former Confederacy rewrite their state constitutions for the sole purpose of disenfranchising African Americans. That's American democracy. Alabama, 1901, still operating under a disenfranchisement constitution. In 1896, the federal government signs off on this with the Plessy decision. Federal government doesn't create, Supreme Court doesn't create segregation or Jim Crow. The Supreme Court sanctions it. And the federal government is like, we're hands off. And there was only one state in the former Confederacy that did not rewrite its state constitution during this period, and that was the state of North Carolina, because they didn't need to, because they lead a political coup in this most populous city in 1898 in Wilmington. The most successful, up until recently, the most successful political coup in American history. So they use violence. They say, we don't need to change the Constitution. We're handling this at the point of a gun. 1898. There's a lot of conversation, discussion going on the last few days about political violence in America. And how people talking about it now as though it's an aberration. Political violence isn't an aberration in America. Political violence is as American as cherry pie, as H. Rap Brown would say. This nation was born out of political violence. That's what the American Revolution was. And we're pretending as though this is some aberration. No, we're just seeing it more visible. That's part of the American tradition. And the collapse of democracy occurred because of political violence. Collapsing the numbers of folk who would be included in it. But we get the civil rights movement because African Americans never give up. Right? I mean, the persistence of resistance is one of the things that I emphasize to my students all the time. I say, if you remember nothing else from what I have to say over the next 4 or 5 months that we're together, you must remember the persistence of resistance. And to this day, I randomly get emails from students I had in the past. They won't say anything. They'll just type in their head, persistence of resistance. I'm like, good, I'm glad you remember. The civil rights movement is critical. It's this third juncture because we see in the civil rights era, civil rights movement is not a period where black folk finally decide to protest again. It's a part on this continuum of struggle. But it's the most public part since that Reconstruction period. And we also get fundamental legal change, which is why it's important. The first thing is, we're now operating, by the time we get to the 50s and 60s, African Americans now have a new constitutional foundation because they have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. They can finally, for the first time, and we see this happening with Charles Hamilton Houston and the cadre of lawyers that he produces out of Howard University. Probably the best thing that Howard University ever did. I'm just going to leave that as a Morehouse man. Was create this cadre of lawyers who Charles Hamilton Houston trains and says we have to be social engineers. We have to use the Constitution as a weapon of democracy, and we can wield it for the first time because we have the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Houston actually said, he said, look, you're either, talking about black lawyers, and only a handful at the time, he said, you're either a social engineer or a parasite. You're either preying on black folk or you're using the law and the Constitution as a weapon to advance the liberties of the weak. We need to keep that in mind today as we see these corporate law firms fold and buckle. And it's Charles Hamilton Houston who leads the campaign, doesn't live long enough to see it come to fruition, but that gives us the Brown decision. And Brown was critical because in order to do away with legally sanctioned segregation and racial discrimination, you had to overturn the Plessy decision. And so Brown overturns that. But it's not enough simply to have courtroom victories. Courtroom victories like Brown were necessary, but they were insufficient. You had to have internal pressure. You had to create crises, as Dr. King would say, to put pressure on the federal government to step in, once again, on the side of those who are advocating for expanding democracy. So that short period of Reconstruction is when we get sort of federal support of advancing democracy. It's a short window, less than 10 years. And then the federal government is on the sidelines again. And African-American activists understood that you had to bring the federal government into this struggle for expanding democracy because they were fighting against government. They weren't just fighting against individuals. You know, we often talk about, somebody like George Wallace and say the problem during the civil rights era was you had folk like George Wallace and Bull Connor. These are duly elected public officials. They weren't out of step with white Southerners. They were doing exactly what they were sent there to do. Exactly what they were sent there to do. So black folk are fighting against state government. They're fighting against government. And so the federal government becomes critical in that struggle because they need government to fight against government. And to bring the government onto the side of those who are trying to advance democracy, we see the struggle centered around creating crises to force change. And if we just look at the South from that 55 to 65 period, we get the Montgomery bus boycott, creating a blueprint for mass mobilization. The Nashville sit-ins, young people, students engaged in disciplined, strategic, economic boycotts and protests. We get the freedom rides, creating an international crisis, increasing external pressure on the federal government to address the problems of segregation and discrimination during this heightened Cold War period. We get the Birmingham Children's Crusade. You are never too young to fight for your freedom, creating crises, getting finally John F. Kennedy to come out and say, okay, we got to do something about this. And then finally in 65 with the Selma campaign, creating another crisis that compels Lyndon Johnson to get Congress to say, we actually need to do something to protect voting rights. So it's not just the law, it's people in action, willing to put their bodies on the line, that creates the gains that we will see during the civil rights era. And the gains are real. We often measure civil rights success simply by these legislative victories. Now, that's not the full sum of how we should measure movement success. We're talking about engaging people, getting folk who have been marginalized and now part of the body politic, participating in politics. But these legal victories were critical. The Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Immigration and Nationality Act, and the Fair Housing Act, 64 to 68. That changes the civil rights landscape. And those same folk who fought to maintain segregation, those same folk who fought against every single one of these bills that were designed to create a more equal, more equitable society, are the same ones who are fighting against it now. The same ones who are trying to roll back, who have been rolling back the Voting Rights Act, who are trying to roll back the 1964 Civil Rights Act, who are just setting aside the Immigration and Nationality Act, and who have forever been fighting against the Fair Housing Act. And we see that now. They're still litigating the civil rights era and the gains that were made to make America more democratic. So we've always been fighting about democracy. It just looks a little different today. What was critical to that civil rights moment wasn't just, again, not just laws and or court cases and getting a series of new laws on the books. What was critical was political education. Activists understood that in order to restructure democracy, and that's what we were talking about, what they were actually doing, restructuring American democracy, that people, ordinary people, everyday people had to understand the mechanics of democracy. Political education was not optional. Political education was essential. And we see that in the citizenship schools that September Clark created. We see that in the community education programs, political education storybooks, cartoon storybooks in places like Lowndes County, Alabama. We see that in the participatory democracy model that Ella Baker helps instill into the organizing of SNCC activists. One of the things that we have forgotten, one of the lessons that we have moved away from in the post-civil rights era is that of political education. It's not enough simply to mobilize voters. We can do that, but you also have to engage in this process of political education. Like that was at the heart of this movement. And it has to be at the heart of the movement that we're creating to build a new democracy today. But with every gain, there is substantial opposition. It's important to pause and recognize the legacies of the civil rights movement because they are real. You often get this question, like, well people push back. Are you saying that, there hasn't been progress in America? That's a stupid ass question. Like, what are you saying? Like, of course there has been, right? I'm not in chains, right? Like, I'm here. Of course there's been progress. Dismantle the legal apparatus for Jim Crow. That's progress. Expanded democratic inclusion, right? Not just for African American, but black men, black women, people of color, women. I mean, that's progress. Rise in black community empowerment. That's progress. Historic mayoral elections right here in Atlanta, early 1970s, Maynard Jackson. I mean, that is progress. The civil rights gains were real. They were real, but they also were not enough. And we're also seeing some 50 years later, what was created to sustain and advance opportunity was not rooted or anchored in a place that would allow it to withstand the new assault on it that we're seeing now. And that new assault isn't coming out of thin air. And we hear a lot, of folk and political conservatives will say, those who are still trying to cling to some semblance of the Republican Party, they'll say, well, Trumpism, MAGA is not true republicanism, right? I mean, that's Ronald Reagan's conservatism. Like, he wasn't a racist too. right? Like the Republican Party in 1980, and this isn't sort of a partisan critique. This is a professional historian making an observation. In 1980, Ronald Reagan, right, as part of that sort of attempt to create a new national party, is welcoming disaffected white Southerners into the Republican Party. Nixon did that with the Southern strategy. They're like, no, this is a home for white supremacists. This is 1980. Ronald Reagan will announce his run for presidency, former governor of California, not in California, not in Washington, D.C., but in Mississippi. But in Mississippi. And the place that he goes to in Mississippi, the county that he goes to in Mississippi to announce his presidency, is the same county in which 3 civil rights workers are murdered in 1964. That's not an accident. Ain't nothing else happened there in history. He's signaling to white Southerners that I am on your side. And that's not an accident. But we're so caught up again in, I teach, my wife is also a Spelman graduate, and sometimes I come home and I tell her these stories, and she has this look of bewilderment of my interactions with students. And I'm like, oh, that's right. You think I'm teaching all black students. Like, no. Ohio State is not a HBCU. And I remember one time talking to these students about Ronald Reagan and his conservative counter-revolution to the civil rights movement. And I talked about, Reagan announcing in this county. And the student says, well, Dr. Jeffries, maybe he didn't know what happened in 1964. And I'm like, do you think his campaign bus was just driving from D.C. to California, happened to break down in Mississippi? It's like, we will go through these sort of intellectual gymnastics to avoid the truth. That doesn't mean if you're an inheritor of this that you're responsible for that, but you got to understand what this history is because it's still relevant to the current moment. And so we have this moment, we get these political gains coming out of the 60s and 70s, and then we get the Republican Party leaning into white supremacy. We get the war on drugs and mass incarceration, which is limiting the ability of African Americans to engage in the electoral process and also creating new racial controls at a time where we see real parallels to what's happening now. Economic recession, so white folk are catching hell too, but it's being framed as the fault of the other, at the same time as we're having the federal government disinvesting in social programs, and those programs that are designed to help people survive and endure. So the parallels to the late 70s, early 1980s are really real, but now it's on steroids in terms of what we're doing. So the backlash will intensify, and starting in 2008 with Trump's, with Barack Obama's election. The most important election, I argue, the most important election of the first quarter century of the 21st century is not 2024. It may wind up being, we'll see, verdict's still out. It's not 2020 or 2016. It's not even 2008. The most important election, in my opinion, is 2010. It's the Tea Party insurgency. Because that's when we saw state legislatures go hard right. That's when we saw Republicans at the national level saying, you know what, we're okay leaning more explicitly into racism. That changes everything. It's coming on the heels of the 2010 census, so we're beginning to see this hard right turn with gerrymandering. They're able to push through new laws that are restricting voting rights. This is all 2010. And why do we see that? What's the rationalization? What's the motivation for that? It's the movement that emerges as a result of a black family being in the White House. It took me a little while to figure out how you could have Obama elected in 2008. Because, as much as we like to think now, it's like, oh, it was just black folk and progressives who voted for Barack Obama. No, you needed a lot of white people to vote for Barack Obama. How can you get him elected twice and then get a Donald Trump elected twice? And 2020 becomes an anomaly that we'll talk about in a second. And it took me a while to figure it out. And I realized that, oh, this has everything to do with the people he ran against. John McCain and Mitt Romney. Because for whatever fault you may have with their politics, with their policy positions, the one thing I have to give both of them credit for is that they refused to lean hard into white supremacy and racism. They refused. You recall John McCain, when the voter was like, oh, he's a Muslim and trying to try all this stuff. And he was like, no, stop. Stop. I give them credit for that. They deserve credit for that. Because racism in America, white supremacy in particular, is the most powerful political tool that this nation has ever created. And those two said, we're not going in there, we're going to play this straight on policy. The reason why they lost is that McCain and Romney weren't racist enough. They were not racist enough to animate that percentage of white folk who would be excited to have an explicit racist in the White House. And that's what we got in 2016 and again in 2024. 2010 becomes, although there in 2012, 2008 and 2012, we don't get that shift at the executive level, that Tea Party insurgency. We get a surge in political conservatives, far-right conservatives who are willing to start increasingly lean into racism and create space for explicit racists to be a part of this new body politic. And then we get judicial complicity, the Supreme Court shifting increasingly to the right with Shelby versus Holder, gutting the Voting Rights Act. We see moving into the late teens, voter suppression mechanisms. You know, one of the things that we got to be really careful about in this period of censorship. One of the projects that I'm working on is with back again with the National Civil Rights Museum. And, you know, we're doing sort of the last 50 years, if you will, exhibition on the last 50 years of the Black freedom struggle. And, you know, there were some donors who were reviewing some of the documents, and they were a little bit concerned about how we were framing this period of democratic expansion, attempts for democratic expansion to be rolled back. They were like, well, you know, these voter suppression laws that were being passed at state legislatures that were all GOP led, and they're naming them. Republican controlled legislatures passed these voter suppression laws. And the pushback was, well, actually, you know, there was an increase, and we see in 2018 and 2020, right? There seems to be, and this was John Roberts' argument, there seems to be actually an increase in Black voter participation. So how can you say that these were supposed to be discriminatory laws? And so we think you should remove that. And I said, like hell, we're going to remove that. Because the outcome doesn't determine the intent. The intent was to discriminate. The intent was to make it harder for people to vote. And it was. It was more difficult for people to vote. But only because of an extraordinary effort by grassroots organizations and national organizations do you get more people engaged. And then in 2020, only because of a global pandemic. Like, why doesn't Donald Trump win in 2016? Because 2020. Because 2020 was the freest and most fair election that this nation has ever had. There was more access to be able to participate in the election than in any other time before, and certainly not in 2024. And their margin was thin. But that's why 2020 was an aberration. People didn't wake up, and you still got 70-some million people who voted for this guy and for the agenda that he was supporting. It was because we had actually made democracy more open. And it's not a surprise then that immediately after seeing that, we see the pushback. Right? The pushback is in part connected to what Trump is doing now, but the lead up to it. States like Texas going from, for example, during the pandemic, in Houston, the city of Houston, Harris County, most populous county for Black folk in Houston, Texas, having in all of its precincts ballot drop boxes, for example, so people can come up and drop their ballots, to going to one for the entire county. One. That's voter suppression, because you're making it harder. And in an election, in a society in which elections are decided by just a few votes, you don't have to go back to the 1901 Constitution to disenfranchise everybody. You just got to make it more challenging for a handful, and you can win the election. So that's the era that we're in. But now this is on steroids. And we saw it coming. This is all outlined in Project 2025, but now we see it within the last 6 or so months. The attacks on democratic institutions to undermine the integrity of the political process, the erosion of basic civil rights, going after marginalized groups that should come as no surprise, authoritarian tactics, the disregard for congressional oversight, the unwillingness of Congress, controlled by the willingness rather of Congress to give up its constitutional authorities as a result, as it connects to budgeting and checks and balances. And then finally, this last part, the threat to democratic norms, the disregard for political conventions, promotion of political polarization, and actions that erode public trust in democratic processes. One of the things that should be clear, whether we saw it in 2016, but certainly if you missed it in 2016, you should see it now, that there aren't a lot of rules governing the presidency. We went some 250 years on governed by sort of a white gentleman's agreement that either party loyalty, patriotism to a white supremacist government, or principles, a belief in democracy, a belief that people should vote, even if that is limited, that those three would be enough to limit authoritarian impulses. That's not written down. There aren't guardrails. That was the gentleman's agreement. This is just what we're going to do. And so what we're seeing is when you put into power somebody who has no principles, has no party loyalty, this is what you get. This is what you get. And you get a court that says you can do whatever you want. And why is that? Because we're dealing with that damn Constitution that doesn't create the guardrails. So when we think about this new democracy, it can't be based on gentlemen's agreements among slaveholders. There are new principles. And there's a number of folk who are engaged in these conversations. Our sister Stacey Abrams is now talking about not only the 10 steps that lead to authoritarianism, but also 10 steps that we need to sort of remake what's going forward. So, we all need to be having these different conversations about what this looks like. But when we get to that side of, okay, what do we want to see built up out of this? I think there are 3 core principles that need to undergird it all. The first is we have to be talking about inclusive participation. Ensure that every voice is both heard and valued, actively removing barriers to civic engagement for all citizens. That's key. That's key. Removing barriers. I don't care what side of the political spectrum you fall on. You should be for making it easier for people to participate in the political process and not making it more difficult. Anybody who's trying to make it more difficult is fundamentally anti-democratic. And so we need to do the things that makes it possible for more people, for everyone, to be able to participate in the political process. Now, people will say, and we've seen this as part of the effort around voter ID, that no, we have to put in laws that makes it more challenging, voter identification, because of ballot fraud and people who abuse the the access to the ballot. America doesn't have a voter ballot fraud problem. Americans don't even vote. What are we talking about here? They're certainly not voting 2 and 3 and 4 times. So we have to do what's necessary to make it more inclusive. Institutional accountability, this is critical. We were just playing around talking about checks and balances, but if you don't actually have people who are willing to ensure and place on the other aspects of other branches of government checks and balances, then you get these rogue runaway authoritarians. And we also, and this flipped quick, we also have to say, all right, if we're going to maintain this federal system, then what sort of checks and balances are we going to have in that federal system? Because for the longest, African Americans were fighting against state government. And now, in many places in the South, you're still fighting against state government, but you're fighting against state government and the federal government. And we have some state governments in blue states who are like, hold on, right? Like, no, we're going to do this a little differently. So we have to reimagine what federalism actually looks like. And if the federal government wants to play this game of withholding dollars and resources, then we need to think seriously, state governments, about, well, what are you going to do about withholding California, the tax revenue that you send to the federal government? New York State, Michigan. Like, 2 can play at that game. But when we get to the other side of this, that's a survival mechanism. When we get to the other side of it, what structures do we create that are strong enough to maintain institutional accountability? What are we doing with our justices and the Supreme Court to make sure they don't become an activist court that they always said that it wasn't going to be, that we clearly have it as now? We're living in a moment where Clarence Thomas is the moral anchor of the Supreme Court. He's the center. Because there's no institutional accountability that would never allow that to happen. And the third thing, we have to have equitable representation. The people have to be represented. No, you can't have electoral college holdover from slavery. I mean, that's ridiculous. So we have to have equitable representation at all levels of government. And to do this, these last 2 slides, to do this, educators, and this is why I'm always happy to partner with LFJ and in particular, is because educators have to be the architects of this new democracy. We have a role. And by educators, I'm not just talking about classroom teachers. I'm saying that educators are anyone who sees the transmission of knowledge as essential to our shared future. Right? So educators broadly defined, that's formal educators, teachers, librarians, professors, what we do in the classroom. We have to be talking about, we have to be critiquing democracy, but also getting our students to think about, what does a new democracy look like? Community educators, parents, mentors, neighbors, we have to be engaged in conversation and dialogue. Not with those who are caught up in the cult and are unwilling to deal with facts and are just rooted in fantasy and fiction. Like, we don't got time for that anymore. Ain't converting those people anymore. But folk who are feeling this, farmers who are losing their farms, like, okay, you ready to have a conversation now? And if you're not, fine, right? Just lose your stuff to agribusiness, right? But if you're ready, let's have a conversation. So we need to be engaged in these conversations as community educators. And then finally, thinking about where we are, what has brought us together, is cultural educators are going to be key to helping construct, to build this new democracy. Artists, storytellers, filmmakers, activists, that's the medium that is most effective. Right? And certainly the ways in which young people are communicating today. Right? So we have a vital role to play in constructing this new democracy. And finally, teaching is absolutely an act of resistance. So this idea of educators and what we do, whether we're the filmmakers or we're the neighbors or we're the teachers, the professors, it is an act of resistance, and a critical act of resistance that will get us to the place where we can build this new democracy. So how we teach in our schools, homes, houses of worship shapes what our communities demand and what our democracy becomes. That's why in this moment, where we're education, we're talking about African American history and American history in truthful and honest ways, while we cannot shut up, we cannot stop teaching what needs to be taught in an honest, accurate, and effective way. We have to be doubling down on this. There are many folk who are willing in classrooms, and I understand it. I deal with K through 12 teachers all the time. I deal with colleagues at the university all the time, and they're like, Dr. Jeffries, I'm afraid. I'm afraid to teach this because what if somebody on the outside takes it and distorts what I'm teaching? Like, one, we don't have anything to be afraid of because we're not making anything up. And the assaults will come, to be sure. But the question that you have to have as an educator, for anybody in this moment, is, are you willing, particularly those, who are working, if you will, not independently, but who are working. And I say this for myself as a professor at a university, that I am not willing to give up my soul to save a job. You can have the job. That's what we all need to be asking ourselves. Given the sacrifices that people made for us to even be in this position in the first place. What are you willing to sacrifice? Given what the stakes are. So teaching is an act of resistance in this moment. Cultivating the vision, we are not simply conveying knowledge, we are cultivating a vision for what a new democracy will be, even if we don't know what that's going to be. We're saying we have to imagine something that has never existed. Because if it existed, we wouldn't be in this situation that we are in now. And then finally, out of the ashes of what is crumbling now, the house that is on fire, something new can actually arise. But we are the ones who have to build it. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.